infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And today's topic is hot, with 3 major papers published in the last few months, and that's the topic of the viral hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And my guest today says it's time to put it to the test. So joining me now is infectious disease physician Stephen LaRosa, MD. Dr. LaRosa, thanks for taking the time to talk about this.
Thanks for having me on, Robert.
Okay, well, let's start out with Alzheimer's. What is it, and how common is it?
Well, Alzheimer's disease is a progressive loss in cognition and function and activities of daily living, and it is a huge problem. It's probably 5.4 million Americans, 35.5 million estimated worldwide in 2010, and that's going to grow to 115 million in 2050. It's estimated that 10% of people over 65, which is a rapidly increasing population, are affected, and half of people over 85, which is also a rapidly increasing population, are affected. So it's a huge problem.
And as far as treating this condition, this disease, how are we doing there?
Right. Well, we have a few licensed drugs. There's the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Probably the most well-known is Aricept or donepezil. There's also the NMD receptor antagonist, memantine, known as Namenda. That tends to be reserved more for moderate to severe Alzheimer's. The first-line drugs are the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and they provide some improvement in cognition and function, not really durable and not really addressing the pathophysiology of the disease. So they're usually usually first line is the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and then Namenda or memantine is usually added.
Okay, now recently, in the past several months, there's been a handful of studies that have hypothesized of a viral cause. And you've been really on this topic on your blog and on social media. Dr. LaRosa, can you elaborate on this?
Yes. So, the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is the laying down of beta amyloid in plaques in the brain and hyperphosphorylated tau protein in neurofibrillary tangles. And that is what's thought to lead to the decreased cognition and function. And many people are focusing their efforts, many companies are focusing their efforts on attacking the amyloid. But the question then remains, well, why are people laying down all this amyloid in their brain? And there's been some really fascinating studies. I mean, as an infectious disease physician, I never thought I'd be focusing on Alzheimer's disease, but just some fascinating data. Probably the first came out of Mass General Rudy Tanzi's lab, which would suggest that amyloid protein is an ancient immune protein that's job is to actually entrap microorganisms. And 2 microorganisms which he found that amyloid entraps are HSV1, herpes simplex virus 1, better known as the cause of cold sores, and HHV68, which pretty much affects all of us in the first couple of years of life. But if you inject animals with these 2 viruses, the animals will very rapidly produce amyloid and entrap and ensnare these organisms. And so what it suggests, what the data out of Tanzi's lab suggests, is that the amyloid is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing as an immune protector. It's just being assaulted, if you will, by an onslaught of viral invaders.
Okay. Is there any other studies that you like to talk about?
So around the same time or in the same actual issue, that Tanzi's data came, there was data from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, which they had 3 different cohorts of brains that were studied. And they were looking for a whole host of things associated with Alzheimer's, but what they couldn't ignore was HHV6A and HHV7 were showing up in abundance in areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's disease, and they were not seen in controls or people who had neurodegeneration from other reasons like vascular dementia. And they also found that the HHV6A was involved in processing of amyloid, that it was associated with the plaque density, with the clinical dementia rating. So their study was elegant in the fact that not only were they finding these viruses there, they were seeing more of a trend towards causality in terms of the changes it was having on gene expression. And you can actually even look at HHV6A and say the more that was in the brain, the more neurodegeneration or neuronal loss you were seeing. So that was the fascinating second study. The third study, which is really what we like to call the smoking gun, is the data from Taiwan, which looked at approximately 33,000 patients and looked at patients who had new onset HSV-1 infection and were more than 50 years old. And what they found there was having new HSV infection was associated with a 2.5-fold increased risk of going on to developing dementia. And not only that, but if you were treated with an antiviral, you had a 90% reduction in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So you really could abrogate the whole risk of developing Alzheimer's if you were actually treated for the HSV. There was actually similar data in people it wasn't as strong as the HSV data, but with zoster, that there was an increased risk of dementia with zoster and a 45% reduction in the development of Alzheimer's if you actually got treated for your zoster or shingles. So 4 different viruses, the most data being around HSV-1, also varicella zoster, the cause of shingles, and then HHV6 and HHV7.
Now, you looked at all these studies, and on your blog, you say it's time to move the research from association to causality. Dr. LaRosa, what are you suggesting?
Right. So, it's easy to criticize these association studies and say, well, the HSV is there, and these people then develop Alzheimer's, but it could be a case of what's called true, and unrelated. Mm-hmm. And the only way you move from association to causation is to actually implement a treatment that would address these viruses and see if it changes outcomes. So what I'm suggesting is that it's time for a placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial of an agent that is active against these 4 viruses that have been implicated in Alzheimer's, and looking at measures of cognition and function at 18 months, which is thought by people in the field to be clinically meaningful, and to look for clinically meaningful improvements or less decreasing in cognition and function with treatment over time. I think that's the only way that will address this. Alzheimer's is a field where there's been lots of excitement early on in phase 2 studies, but they've had tremendous failures of new agents in phase 3 studies. So my feeling is there's not much to offer these patients. This is a rapidly growing population, and it's time to try something new.
All right, very interesting. To see more on Dr. LaRosa's thoughts on this topic, you can visit his blog, My Thoughts on the Future of Infectious Diseases and Medicine, at drlarosa.blogspot.com. Thank you, Dr. Stephen LaRosa, for your time and expertise, sir.
Thanks very much.
If you are worried you have Lyme disease, or just like the outdoors, and want the peace of mind of knowing whether you have Lyme disease or not, there is a new Lyme screening test based on decades of research by Dr. Richard Marconi, a professor at VCU Medical Center. For more information, visit glymedx.com. That's glymedx.com. glimedx.com or email at info@glimedx.com.